You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, in this segment, we're going to take a look at socialism and progressive reform, and this is the first part of several parts that I will be dealing with. But one of the things that's most important about America is that it has a very rich heritage that comes from the immigrant experience, and it is known as socialist organizing. Now, when we talk about patriotism, now it's most often the right wing of America that claim to express the American spirit. You know, the right wing always says that they are the ones that have the American spirit, that they revere its symbols, and those who criticize the government are anti-patriotic. What I want to help you understand is that the terms progressive and patriotic and socialism is part of the American immigrant experience. It is part of the American heritage. Right? It's just that since the Reagan administration in the 1980s, the conservative element has taken over the dialogue and labeled anything to as its counterparts as this negative experience known as socialism. So I want you to understand that the terms progressive and patriotic and socialism are part of the immigrant experience. They are part of the American heritage. So let's take a look at the Pledge of Allegiance. Let's take a look at the man who wrote it. His name is Francis Bellamy. Now, Francis Bellamy wrote the Pledge of Allegiance in 1892. Now, one of the things about Francis Bellamy was that he was a leading Christian socialist. Now, he's going to be fired from his Boston ministry for his sermons because he depicted Jesus as a socialist. Now, students, you need to recognize that Christianity is socialism. Christianity is a challenge to treat everyone as a human being when redistributing the collection of wealth. That Trinity represents the unified presence of humanity. That Trinity is most awesome in Christianity, of God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. That Trinity is the unified presence of humanity. The sacrament, the body of Christ. When you take a look at Christian churches, all churches are built around the physical presence of Christ's commitment. And what is his commitment? Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give shelter to the homeless, give drink to the thirsty, house the refugee, provide shelter for the refugee. So this is what drove Francis Bellamy to write the Pledge of Allegiance. He appreciated, or he had, a collective and an egalitarian vision of America. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So get to know it when you pledge allegiance to this country, when you pledge allegiance to the flag. And so, remind the right-wing radio and television hate mongers about the socialist influence in the Pledge of Allegiance. Now let's go to another person. Her name is Emma Lazarus. And let's take a look at the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor huddled masses yearning to breathe free. This poem, known as The New Colossus, was written by Emma Lazarus. She was a poet of considerable repute in her day. She was a well-known figure in literary circles. She was a closet socialist. She didn't come out as a socialist, but she understood very clearly the principles of socialism, and she avowed to its principles. And she wrote this Welcome to the Wretched of the Earth in 1883 as an effort to project an inclusive definition of the American dream, an egalitarian definition of the American dream. Let's go and listen to her poem, The New Colossus.
Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that Twin Cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my light beside the golden door. Emma Lazarus.
Okay. Now let's take a look at another woman. Her name is Katharine Lee Bates. Now, Katharine Lee Bates was a professor of English at Wellesley College. She was an ardent feminist. She was a lesbian socialist. And she's going to write one of the most beautiful poems that is that everyone today in the United States recites. It's America the Beautiful. And up until a few years ago, this song was sung in baseball games during the seventh inning stretch to honor those who died in 9/11. Now, this song that so many patriots sing today reflects this lesbian's view that U.S. imperialism undermines the nation's core values of freedom and democracy and liberty. And she was inspired to write this poem after visiting the Shoshone people's lands in Colorado and in Wyoming. And she visited what eventually will become Yellowstone National Park. And it was this beauty that she encountered that inspired her in the poem. But she understood at that time that U.S. imperialism undermines values of freedom and liberty, that she found so much expressed in the beautiful landscape that she visited when she was out there in Wyoming. So the song, or the poem's final words, "And crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea," is not about pursuing wealth. It is about social justice. So, this poem was put to song. And so the next time you hear right-wing evangelists or anybody from conservative America, and you listen to them as they're singing America the Beautiful, whisper in their ear, they're singing a poem from a radical lesbian feminist. Get to know this. Now let's go and let's appreciate the singing of this song by one of the most impressive artists ever, who provides the best rendition I know of America the Beautiful. Let's listen to Ray Charles. Okay, so Frances Bellamy, Emma Lazarus, Katharine Lee Bates. Please, students, understand that the socialist influence is part of the American heritage. Don't be afraid of this particular word. So let's talk about the socialist tradition. Let's talk about progressive reform and the socialist tradition, all right? And you can see with the shirt that I'm wearing, we're talking about the land of the free. Of course, depending on how you're talking about freedom, some restrictions apply, void where prohibited. But nonetheless, let's try to define socialism. Now, first of all, I'm going to go to Noam Chomsky's work and try to appreciate the definition, and he helps me out in providing a very nice, concise definition of socialism. There's no clear-cut blueprints and no cast-in-concrete constitutional arrangements in socialism, okay? There's no specific body of ideas and theories on socialism. Socialism is a process of ideas whereby people arrange, design, and construct a just society. The central goal of socialism is humankind. Socialism places at its center the concept of direct, participatory, mass democracy. This is an involvement by everyone in the decisions that give direction to the social order. See, the aim of socialism is a democratization of life in general, not just the democratization of politics. Now, let me explain this about the democratization of life in general, because in capitalism is forced to address the democratization of politics. The democratization of politics means that, of course, under capitalism, the only way that capitalism could arise was through political democracy, giving the right to vote to those who own property. So socialism doesn't just call for political democracy. I mean, that's the right to vote. And if you can understand, at the turn of the century, in 1900s, the only people who had the right to vote were white males. Who else had the right to vote? They liberated the slave, but slaves were prevented, or freedmen were prevented from voting through the black codes. So political democracy, you can understand that the socialist tradition is saying, well, everybody should have the right to vote. Voting should be a responsibility, especially if you're living in a country that has representative government. But socialists move beyond just political democracy. And the key is that they ask for economic democracy likewise. And what is economic democracy? Economic democracy is the right to a living wage. If you are working full-time, and back then full-time was 60, 70, 80-hour weeks, because there was no such thing as an 8-hour day back then. People worked, as Malcolm X would say, from can't see in the morning to can't see at night. So if you are working and your wage still does not pay for your subsistence, in other words, your subsistence, your food, your clothing, your shelter, and you are working full-time and beyond, and when you get your paycheck, you still can't pay the rent, you still can't buy clothes, and you can't put food on the table. Socialists are saying, hey, wait a minute. Economic democracy, the right to a living wage, that is the socialist principle. So not only is it political democracy, socialists also include economic democracy, that you have a right to a living wage as long as you're a human being. And then dig this, what the socialist tradition is all about. Can we have social equality? Social equality. Because as human beings, we all should be dignified. Just because you're rich, does that mean that you have position, you have privileges? Just because you're rich, you can game the system so that you can get to school? Just because you're rich, you don't have to wait in line? Just because you're rich, there's a line for you and then everybody else? The idea behind the socialists is that as human beings, we all should experience social equality. We should all be treated as human. Do you understand and recognize why Francis Bellamy is going to, in the Pledge of Allegiance, as a Christian socialist, as him understanding Christianity, It is a challenge to treat all human beings as equal, especially when redistributing the wealth. So recognize one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So socialism. Socialism calls for political democracy. Socialism calls for economic democracy. Socialism calls for social equality. Now, back then, it was very, very rough if you were a person of color. Because back then, there were the black codes. There was anti-Chinese immigration legislation. People didn't know what to do with the Mexican. And then, of course, native peoples are being removed from the scene. So for people of color, it was a struggle. So you can imagine, depending on who was doing the organizing and depending on who was the socialist at the time, socialism calls for an end to racial discrimination. Can you imagine? What? Well, gosh, darn, you better watch it, man. Those socialists, they're asking for everything, aren't they? And then, can you imagine, depending on who's doing the organizing, a socialist is asking for the end to gender discrimination, that women should have rights, that women shouldn't be doormats? What? What are you talking about? That's the socialist tradition. Watch it. That's the socialist tradition. Political democracy, economic democracy, social equality, an end to racial and gender discrimination. Can you imagine that? So, as you may know from the previous presentations that I've had in this class, we are all human beings. We are all human beings. Socialists take the position that all persons share certain needs. There exists some minimum requirement of food, shelter, health, and so forth, which all people share across the board. When we talk about society, no decent society would concentrate wealth in the hands of the few while the needs of the majority go unmet. Society has to be organized in such a way that can allow and encourage human beings to realize their humanity, to realize their humanness. So, human beings, from the socialist view, are purposeful beings who are able, if given a chance, to make decisions intelligently. Human beings have intentions and purposes. Human beings can become aware of alternatives and rationally choose amongst them. People are potentially self-directed. People are potentially self-determining. People are capable of self-expression. People are capable of creativity. But you have to be given the chance. So, how are you given the chance? Equality of condition. Equality of condition is the foundation of socialism. And this is what you will learn in the readings of the second wave of immigrants that are being brought to this country. They have a dream of equality. So get to know it. They believed in civil rights for all Europeans. Because after all, this is a nation that was made for white males. So I say Europeans because many had their reservations about native peoples, And many had a hesitancy about the blackness of Africans. And of course, there's the Mexican. How do you deal with the Mexican? But nonetheless, socialism, this is the great heritage. The equality of condition for all. Right? So, let's appreciate the progressive movement. Because while the socialists and the capitalists are battling it out in the economic landscape of society, okay, one calling for revolution, the immediate radical changes, and the other calling for status quo privileges, stop social change at all costs, those stuck in the middle of the two extremes decide to wake up and call for reform, a peaceful, gradual change. So this is the progressive movement. When we read about the progressive movement, we will realize that it came about as a result of the populist crusade. It came about as a result of capital-labor conflicts. It came about as a result of socialist organizing, socialist ideals. It also came about as a result of the assassination of the president. But the idea behind progressive reform was the desire to humanize capitalism, not to eliminate capitalism as socialists are inclined to do. So progressives came into being to control monopolies. Progressives came into being to end the violence that was associated when workers attempted to organize for their interests, and capitalists attacked them ruthlessly for organizing. Progressives feared revolution. Progressives feared intense class conflict. Progressives feared racial equality. But the laissez-faire capitalism, the laissez-faire individualism, this philosophy that was being pursued by capitalists and by conservative America and the Republican Party, this philosophy is great if you're a member of the wealthy, if you're a member of the elite classes. This philosophy of less government is what the reformers begin to challenge, is what the progressive reform movement is begin to challenge. So who are the progressives? Well, progressives are fairly prosperous professionals and they're businessmen. Now, they're motivated by personal ambitions, but they're also motivated by moral indignation. Do not confuse progressive reformers with socialists. See, socialists are automatically progressive, but progressives are not socialists. So the most pressing questions for progressives are not humanitarian. They are moral. They are political. So if you take a look at the progressives, the ideas that were generated by the progressives led to notions of using the government efficiently, using the government scientifically to end corruption, to control big business, throw out the crooks, and return power to good citizens. Get rid of monopolies and bring back the notion of free enterprise. So there are a lot of important progressive heroes. They're intellectuals, they're sociologists, historians, politicians, and perhaps the most important progressive hero is Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt is, of course, the national hero of the progressive movement. Now, you have to understand that Theodore Roosevelt became president because he was a vice president under the president that was assassinated. And Theodore Roosevelt recognized that there was a groundswell of change occurring in this nation. Now, Theodore Roosevelt presented himself as one of those from the West, even though he was from the elite class in New York. He was from the wealthy. But he presented himself as a cowboy, as a Westerner. He loved to go outdoors. And one of the things about Teddy Roosevelt was when he visited Wyoming and he experienced the Shoshone's breathtaking environment, he experienced what Katharine Lee Bates experienced as she went out to Wyoming. He fell in love with the area that would eventually become Yellowstone National Park. Why? Why would it become that? Because he vowed that capitalism would not destroy this heaven's gate, as he referred to it. Now, in 1902, he will sponsor with Senator Newland the Reclamations Act that eventually will give us the national park system. This is why we have national parks today, to prevent capital from destroying pristine areas. However, every administration since the election of Ronald Reagan has chiseled away the foundation of the park system. And under this current administration, everything is being sold off. Now, in the winter of 1903, coal miners in the Appalachian area went on strike. This meant that East Coast cities would not have coal to burn during the winter months, which meant that people would freeze to death. So Roosevelt got everyone together and said, nope, get over here. We're going to create an arbitration commission and we're going to end this strike. And in March 1903, they ended the strike because he's going to tell the American public that this was his square deal, the square deal between capital and labor. And what he will attempt to do is he's going to go to the rich and he's going to tell them that's enough. You have enough wealth. You've taken the wealth from the market. You've kept it to yourselves. I think that's enough. We're going to redistribute your wealth. I'm going to break you up. He strengthened the Interstate Commerce Act with the Mans-Elkin Act. Under his administration, he's going to pass the Hepburn Act of 1906 to determine railroad rates, and he's going to go and break up the monopolies. Because he told the rich, you need to give service to this nation. You've taken all this wealth. This country has made you rich. Now give back. Very simple. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, if he would find out what this administration is doing right now, he would sit on Donald Trump. But right now he's just turning in his grave. But most important during Roosevelt's administration was the time that he was reading a novel in the Oval Office while eating his favorite country breakfast of sausage, bacon, ham, and eggs. And this one man named Upton Sinclair was a socialist. And this socialist is going to write a very important book called The Jungle. It was a story about Lithuanian immigrants surviving in Chicago and working in the stockyards and the slaughterhouses of the meatpacking industry. Now, in this book, Sinclair's depiction of despicable working conditions and of rats and human parts ultimately finding their way into canned and packed meat stirred an alarm in Roosevelt. See, during the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt witnessed the death of his soldiers. Their deaths was not because of the war. Their deaths was because they ate tainted food. The canned food given to soldiers led to the number one cause of death in this war, dysentery. Blood on the saddle, blood on the ground, blood all around. See, because dysentery, that's, your pieces of your colon start falling out. So maybe that's why Roosevelt's soldiers were called the Rough Riders. But it is said that after reading part of the novel where rats and pieces of human fingers and arms find their way into the canned ham, the story is that Roosevelt is going to toss his country breakfast of ham, bacon, and sausage, and that day he's going to go and approach Congress, and he's going to have the Meat Inspection Act passed, which eventually turns into the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is why we eventually will have inspections of food products, the Food and Drug Administration. Now, here is a perfect example of a socialist influencing a progressive to reform the system. So pay attention to that throughout the rest of the course. Socialist organizing influences progressive reform. A progressive president responded to a socialist critique of society. Let's take a look at a video addressing, or a documentary addressing Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and this will end the first part of Socialism and Progressive Reform.
The Industrial Revolution of the 1800s had a dramatic effect on economic and social life around the globe. The economies of industrializing nations shifted from agriculture to manufacturing, from rural to urban. Thanks to innovations in technology, energy production, and manufacturing, factories churned out large quantities of new products at lower prices. Almost overnight, cities swelled to support new industries. Soon, people were flocking to the growing cities, looking for work and a better life. But factory life did not live up to its promise. The workers had few rights. Wages were low, hours were long, working conditions were often unsafe, and unemployment, or worse, was always just an accident away. These harsh working conditions were common at the turn of the 20th century. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a novel about the American meatpacking industry.
At the time that The Jungle was written, the plants were horrible places to work. They were full of violence, they weren't clean, and frequently diseased and dead animals were slaughtered and made into food.
Sinclair's novel follows the story of a young Lithuanian, Jurgis Rudkus, who arrives in America seeking freedom and opportunity. He finds work in a prosperous and, as he learns to his dismay, filthy Chicago meatpacking plant.
Think about an individual coming from a rural agricultural kind of society, whether you think about Jurgis coming from Lithuania or a black migrant coming from the deep south, Mississippi, coming into a large industrial city, working in a mass production industry like meatpacking. Sinclair was writing on the crust of a giant wave of social and economic change that took place in the course of the late 19th century.
Before writing The Jungle, Sinclair spent 7 weeks around Chicago's meatpacking plants. He studied details about the work itself, the home lives of workers, and the structure of the business.
Upton Sinclair went into the plants and he saw dead animals being slaughtered. He saw filth all over the plant. He saw products going into sausage that shouldn't have been there. But more importantly, he came out of the plant radicalized by what happened to the workers, how they got chewed up the same way the food did.
Sinclair used the horrors he witnessed as the basis for Jurgis's fictionalized story. As Jurgis discovers, work in the plant involves back-breaking labor in unsafe conditions. When a worker becomes ill or gets injured, he's cast aside, and hundreds of jobless men fight to replace him. Workers in the pickling room have their fingers eaten by acid. Cooks live in danger of falling into open vats of boiling meat.
It was live or die, sink or swim. So the deadened conditions in the slaughtering house and that death that permeated also permeated the battle between the owners and the workers.
It created this traditional, naturalistic, deterministic story in which human beings, just like the animals that are pulled up the chute in the packing plants, and they are pulled up with this sense of optimism at the beginning, this idea of going to America, becoming successful, leaving behind the problems of Europe, and then they go down just like the animals, and they are processed too.
When The Jungle was published, there was a public outcry. Americans were outraged, and they urged the United States Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. More federal laws followed that prevented packers from adding fillers and impurities to meat. And United States Department of Agriculture inspectors were put in every meat plant in the country. But this wasn't the reaction that Sinclair was looking for. He wanted to help the workers. "I aimed at the public's heart," he wrote, "and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." It took decades to improve the working conditions Sinclair criticized in the jungle. The changes came from inside the factories themselves, from members of labor unions making demands of the factory owners. The jungle's pro-worker viewpoint may have been lost on the public at the time, but its powerful message is clear today.
It was a microcosm, a look at the 20th century as it was unfolding and all the different battle lines between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. And in that sense, it's an enduring classic.